Okay, we're back with concept 15.2. It says sex-linked genes exhibit unique patterns of inheritance. And the reason for that is kind of obvious. If you take a look at a picture here, this is an awesome microscope picture of the two chromosomes, the X and the Y chromosome. You see that they're non-homologous. In other words, they are not of equal length and size, so they're not going to have the same positions of genes. They're not going to have the same information on both of them. So in many of the different species, there are small portions of the Y chromosome that are homologous with the X, but for the most part, you'll see that's just not possible. Physically, they're just not the same shape and size. So the X and Y chromosome, in the case of humans, the X and Y chromosome, these sex-linked genes and these sex chromosomes tend to be a little bit different than the autosomes. And what that means is sex-linked genes that are located on the X or the Y, they tend to be inherited in a unique pattern, different from perhaps the other genes that we've been talking about. So in humans and some other animals, there is a chromosomal basis of sex determination. So we're going to see how things are a little bit different because not all living creatures have the same sort of sex determination that humans and mammals do, but we'll take a look at the different possibilities. So in humans and other mammals, there are two varieties of sex chromosomes. You see the larger X and then the much smaller Y. Only the ends of the Y chromosome have some regions that are homologous with the corresponding regions of the X chromosome, but for the most part, these two chromosomes are not aligned and they're not homologous. These small areas on the end that are homologous align these chromosomes or allow these chromosomes to align appropriately during meiosis. And of course, this would only matter in the male, so we would be talking about the testes. So in the female, of course, she's going to produce eggs that only have the X possibility. X is the female sex chromosomes. So all of her eggs will have the X chromosome. In males, of course, you have the possibility of an X and Y. So these homologous portions align during the meiosis process, and the sperm could potentially have an X or potentially could have a Y. And of course, that means in mammals, it's the male sperm cell that determines the future sex of the offspring. As the embryo begins to develop, there is a particular gene located on the Y chromosome that's nicknamed the SRY gene, the sex determining region of Y gene. And this particular gene is what encodes the proteins that direct the development of the various male anatomical features. So if you look at a very early embryo, until it's about 2 months old, the gonads, or the portion of the fetus that will become the gonads, are very rudimentary and they're very generic. They could actually become ovaries or testes up to that point. So until the embryo is, say, beyond, or until the fetus is beyond, say, about 2 months of development, you can't tell. There's no way really to tell if it's a male or female, and the various parts that will eventually become the gonads, they could go either way. They could become ovaries or testes. At that point, if it is a male, if it is to become a male, if it has the XY chromosome, on the Y chromosome there is a gene that begins to produce particular proteins that then direct the male characteristics. So the development of the male sex organs and the development of testes as opposed to ovaries and that type of thing. So here's that great shot again showing the two chromosomes, the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. Females, of course, we already mentioned, are XX, so all eggs produced by the female are going to have the X chromosome. That's the only possibility they have. And males are XY. So what that means is the sperm cells could potentially be X chromosome carrying or Y chromosome carrying. Remember, they're going to distribute randomly within those particular sperm cells. As humans, we're very used to this XXXY type of system, but not all animals have that same method of sex determination. So let's take a look at some of the other living creatures and the varieties of ways that sex is determined through their chromosomes in those creatures. This chart's located on page 290 of your textbook. Does a great job of kind of talking about all the various systems or ways that different creatures produce the male and female variety of their species. So in males and a lot of other mammals, we already mentioned there's an XY system where females produce only X chromosome eggs. Males can produce an X or a Y chromosome. And then, of course, when those are combined, the XX will be female, the XY will be male. In grasshoppers and cockroaches and a lot of other insects, they only have one sex chromosome. So the female will always give the X. The male will either give an additional X or no sex chromosome. So it's an XO system, an X0. So the male will either give the X or no chromosome at all, no sex chromosome at all. If the offspring receives the two X sex chromosomes, it will be considered female. If the offspring only has one X that came from the female and got nothing from the male, then it will be a male. So this is an XO system. In birds and some types of fish and a few different insects, the sex determination is actually done by the female. So in, say, in chickens or in any other bird, it's the female that actually determines the sex. So this is a Z, what they call a ZW system, and it's kind of the reverse of our XY. In this case, the male can only give a Z, but the female can give a Z or a W. If the male receives, or if the offspring receives two Zs, it'll be male. If it has a Z and a W, it will be female. So it's kind of like the XY system, just kind of reversed. Perhaps one of the most interesting systems is in bumblebees or honeybees. They actually have no sex chromosomes at all. The determination of sex is based on whether or not it's a fertilized egg or not. If the egg is not fertilized, so the bees can lay, the queen bee will lay an unfertilized egg, that will be a haploid cell. Well, that cell will actually develop and become a male. So in the male bees, all of their body cells are haploid, containing half of the usual set of chromosomes. If the egg is fertilized, then it's diploid, like you would normally expect. That actually will become a female. This is called a haplodiploid system, and what that means is that male bees have no father. So if you are a male bee, you are fatherless. You never had a father. You developed from an unfertilized egg laid by the queen. All female bees developed from a male and a female. That was a fertilized egg. So they're diploid. They have the full set of complement of chromosomes, and male bees are haploid in all of their cells. So very interesting. They don't even have the sex cells. It's just based on whether they are diploid or haploid in their genetics. Let me correct that. I said they don't have sex cells. Of course they have sex cells. They have male sperm and female eggs. They don't have sex chromosomes. So the bees don't have sex chromosomes. That's what I meant to say. So let's talk about what that means, because in humans, if you're a female, you have XX, you have two chromosomes that align there. And if you're a male, you have XY. And the fact that male and females inherit a different number of X chromosomes, two for female but only one for male, that leads to a pattern of inheritance that is different than what you would expect to see on all of the autosomes. So there are genes that are located on these sex chromosomes. A lot of them have to do with determining your various sexual characteristics, but some of them have to do with other traits as well, particularly on the X, because it's a large full-size chromosome. So because females receive two of them and males only receive one, you're not going to see the same normal pattern that we've been talking about so far. So a gene that's located on either of the sex chromosomes is called a sex-linked gene. That's kind of obvious as to why. Genes on the Y chromosome are called Y-linked genes. There's not very many of these, primarily because the Y chromosome is relatively small. And then genes on the X chromosome, of course, are going to be called X-linked genes. And there are a fair number of these, approximately 1,000 or 1,100 of these X-linked genes. The X chromosome, due to its fairly large size, it has genes, many of which are unrelated to the sex of the creature. But the Y chromosome, mainly the genes on it, are primarily related to sex determination. So fathers pass on X-linked alleles to all of their daughters, but none to their sons. So think about that. The female mother will pass on X-linked alleles to all of her offspring, of course, because all of her eggs will be X chromosome. But the fathers only pass on X-linked alleles to their daughters, and they don't pass on any of those alleles to their sons, because their sons receive the Y chromosome from them. So because of this difference, this means that X-linked genes, they follow a specific pattern of inheritance. For a recessive X-linked trait to be expressed, a female has to have two copies of the allele and be homozygous recessive. That's what you would normally expect. But for a male to show the recessive X-linked trait, he only needs one copy of the allele. We call that hemizygous. So think about those fruit flies we already talked about. For a female to show up with white eyes, she would have to have received the recessive allele from the male and the female, the X and the Y. But for the male to show the white eyes, he only needed one copy of that recessive allele. because there wasn't anything on the Y chromosome of his to cover it up. So the male only needs to have the one copy of the recessive allele. We call that hemizygous. The female has to have what you would normally expect to see in a recessive trait, homozygous. X-linked recessive disorders are much more common in males than females. So when we talk about humans, there are a number of problems and diseases and disorders that are directly related to the X chromosome. And it's pretty obvious that they would more often show up in males. Because if it's there at all, it's going to show up in a male. Because there's nothing on the Y chromosome that might overpower or hide that. We're not going to take the time to go through each of these Punnett squares, but this is just a good example of these X-linked traits. Take a look on page 291 of your textbook. This one's actually talking about being colorblind, and colorblindness is a trait that is an X-linked trait, and it becomes more common in males than females because of that. So take a look on page 291 at the top, and it discusses these three possibilities with mating a male and a female who either are colorblind or not colorblind, or perhaps they are a carrier of that. So you're going to note one thing that I want to point out is that you'll see that there are no male carriers. The male in this case is either going to be colorblind or not, but the female can potentially have normal vision or be colorblind or have normal vision but be a carrier of that particular trait because of her two X's. So that's kind of interesting. Take a look at this if you want more details, but it does kind of tell you what we're talking about here when you see that there are no males that can be carriers of this trait. Because if they are hemizygous for this trait, if they have just the one recessive allele, it's going to show up and they'll have the colorblind characteristic. Some of the disorders that your textbook talks about that are, I wouldn't say common, but are prevalent, and certainly, of course, now we know why they are more common in males than females. A lot of these disorders are caused by recessive alleles located on the X chromosome. Color blindness is a good example. For the most part, it's X-linked. It's an X-linked trait. So you're going to end up with far more males than females, because the female to be colorblind would have to have received a homozygous recessive allele from both her mother and her father. And that's just going to be less common that those two people would happen to meet and marry, and then even less common on top of that they have to both give that recessive allele. So color blindness is more common in men. There's a muscular dystrophy called Duchenne muscular dystrophy that causes a progressive deterioration in muscle control and loss of coordination. That also is an X-linked trait, more common in males. And then hemophilia. Hemophilia you may have heard of before. It's a problem where your blood doesn't clot very well. There's an absence of one or more of the proteins that help clot blood and create a scab. So if you have cuts and scrapes, they tend to bleed more profusely. This oftentimes is more dangerous on internal bleeding. Like if you were playing football and you suffered an injury and you're bleeding on the inside where it can't really be seen, internal hemorrhaging, that can be a major problem if you have hemophilia. That used to be something that was not well controlled. Luckily nowadays we have various injections. You can be given medication through an IV that will help replace some of these missing proteins and help you live a longer, fuller life. This was very common. Hemophilia was one of those traits that was very common and to some degree still is common in royal families. You'll see a lot of these recessive abnormalities and traits pop up in royal families who tended to interbreed amongst a very small group of people. So their genetic pool was very shallow, and so that tended to concentrate some of these recessive traits. So the inheritance of some of these disorders that are recessive disorders that show up more in men, that's one issue. But let's take a look at females, because they have two X's. And you might think, well, that could be a problem too, because in human females that have two X chromosomes, doesn't that mean that they have a duplicate set of this chromosome and that their body might be producing twice as much of the protein that these genes call for, or that might cause some problem? Well, the body has a way of taking care of that. In mammals, in mammalian females, one of the two X chromosomes in every cell is randomly inactivated during embryonic development. So to prevent a duplication of production of proteins by the various genes on these X chromosomes, one of them is basically turned off or inactivated. And that's random as to which one is going to be turned off or inactivated. But one of them will be. And it's going to be developed in what's called a bar body. So that X chromosome that gets turned off condenses into what we call a bar body. That bar body was named after a Canadian anatomist, and the discoverer of this, his name was Murray Barr. And that bar body will kind of lie along the inside of the nuclear envelope of the cell. Now remember I said which of the X chromosomes gets inactivated is completely random. So that's just a 50-50 shot as to which one gets turned off or becomes a bar body. And remember that a female has two X chromosomes. One came from her mom and one came from her dad. So that means approximately half the cells in her body have an active X chromosome from mom and an active X chromosome from dad. So what if the X chromosome passed from her father showed for one particular trait and the X chromosome passed from her mother showed for a different trait? Well, that's going to be kind of odd because now half her body cells will show one trait and half of her body cells will show the other trait. You've probably actually seen this before and didn't realize this. Now, this won't show up in everything, but in some particular characteristics it does show up. Perhaps you've seen a mosaic effect for this character in a tortoiseshell cat. So if you've ever seen a cat that looks like this kitten down at the bottom that we call tortoiseshell, well, that's a factor in this sex-related trait, to where the X that she got from her dad was coding for orange fur, and the X that she got from her mom was coding for black fur. And randomly, one of those X's gets inactivated. So throughout her body, she has different cells. Some have the X-active gene from dad. Some have the X-active, I said gene, I meant chromosome. The X-active chromosome from mom. And because there are different alleles for different hair color here, you get this tortoise shell effect. So this also leads to another kind of cool conclusion. What this means is you could not have a male tortoise shell cat. Now, there may be other ways to get this coloration, but we're talking about this method that results from the inactivation of one X. You cannot have a male tortoiseshell cat, because remember, the male doesn't have two X's, one from mom and one from dad. The male has an X from mom and a Y from dad. So if this fur color is determined by the X chromosome, the male cat will have whatever the mom gave him. So if the mom was black, it would be black. If the mom was orange, it would be orange. So if you have a tortoiseshell mom, you would expect her kittens, if they are male, are likely going to be orange or black, but not tortoiseshell. They would have to have two X's, and one of those X's be randomly turned off, one of them randomly turned on, and that would show this particular pattern of inheritance. You might think it odd, but this type of thing also occurs in humans. It occurs in all mammals. A good example in humans is a particular trait. This would be an example of mosaicism, mosaic, where humans have a recessive X-linked mutation that prevents the proper development of sweat glands. So you can have a female, a woman, who is heterozygous for this trait. She received one X from her dad, one X from her mom, and which X got turned off and turned on is going to be completely random. So she'll have actually patches of skin that operate normally and have normal sweat glands, and patches of skin that do not have sweat glands. And that will be randomly distributed throughout her entire body, depending on if those cells came from a result of mitosis of the male containing the male X or the female X that she received from her parents. So could we have a man with this same condition? Of course, the answer to that is no. He would only receive the one X from his mom. So whatever trait that mom showed, either the proper working sweat glands or the non-functional lacking the sweat glands, that's what the male would show, either or. There wouldn't be the possibility of this mosaic that you might have in females. So an interesting trait here, only seen in females because, again, during early embryonic development, all of these cells have the two X's, of course, but during early embryonic development, to prevent there being like a double production of the proteins that might be called for by those genes, randomly in those embryonic cells, one of the X chromosomes is basically turned off and condenses and becomes an inactive bar body. So because of that, you can see certain traits happen in a mosaic sort of way, in some cases, if it's an X-linked trait. All right, let's take another quick break. Go pet your kitty cat or feed your dog or drop some food into the fishbowl. Come back, get yourself something to eat perhaps, and we'll finish up. We have two more concepts, 15.3 and 15.4. 15.3 says linked genes tend to be inherited together. So now we're going to talk about genes that do tend to be inherited together, kind of as a matched set. And we'll talk about why that happens sometimes as well. We'll be back in just a second.